me talk about three big issues that are impacting our society, that are going on in our society right now that are impacting, namely people of color, and in this case, Black women. So of course, we're about a year or so into a COVID-19 pandemic. One thing that we've learned from this pandemic, which we've seen countless times, is that it has disproportionate impact on Black and brown people, namely Black women. And so yes, all of us, our lives have been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of us in the room, I'm sure, have also lost somebody who has died from COVID, right? And so we're all impacted by this, but it does have different effects on certain populations. In this case, namely Black and brown women, who are often the folks who are more on the front lines and in service positions, who therefore are more impacted by this virus. So that's one big issue that is impacting and affecting what's going on in our society around racial battle fatigue. Secondly, we continue to live in a society where anti-Blackness is happening, as well as misogynoir, which is the intersection between racism and sexism that Black women in particular are navigating. Bettina Love, in her book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, she really describes anti-Blackness as simply a hatred that's directed towards dark bodies, which then results in heavier policing towards those bodies. And then finally, Black women are simultaneously hyper visible at times, but then also invisible at the same time. So since 2014 or so, we've had a number of folks of color, Black folks in particular, who have been killed by police officers. So these are just a few of those names. I highlighted three names in red, in part because even when we highlight the stories of Black men who are harmed by police, we often don't pay similar attention to Black women who are equally as vulnerable to violence. And so Breonna Taylor, for example, Sandra Bland, more recently, Dominique Lucius is a transgender Black woman who was killed. And so again, we often don't highlight the experiences of Black women or Black trans women who are both invisible as well as hypervisible when it comes to racial battle fatigue. So again, these are three larger issues that are happening across our society that are impacting the experience of racial battle fatigue. So what is racial battle fatigue then? So simply put, it's the exhaustion that people of color feel from continued or repeated exposure to racism, which has negative health consequences. And I'll talk about what those health consequences are in just a moment. So I often like to talk about racial battle fatigue in this way. So let's say you get a paper cut, right? And it's a paper cut, it's pretty small. You might notice it a little bit, but it doesn't really affect your day too much. So then let's say you get another paper cut, 30 minutes later in your day. You're gonna start to feel a little bit more than you did the first time. And then you get 3, 4, and then let's say by the end of the day, you now have 15 paper cuts. At that point, those small little paper cuts, which are synonymous to this case as like racial microaggressions, the very small, subtle things that happen, have accumulated over time, which then leads to a wound. So it then leads to fatigue. And so racial microaggressions are those little sort of small things. So for example, a Black person gives a speech and they're told by a white person, wow, you're really articulate, right? It doesn't feel like a very significant comment, but what do you mean by articulate? Are you saying that because I'm Black, I'm not supposed to be, right? And so it's those things that make you question what's happening. You're at the grocery store and you're paying for your groceries. You notice that the cashier puts the change in the person's hand that was in front of you, but when it comes to you to get your change, they put it on the countertop, right? And so then you start to wonder, like, why did that person do that? Or you're an Asian person and somebody asks you where you're from, and you say, well, I'm from Kansas. And they ask you, no, where are you really from? So this presumption that you're not, American, that you're foreign. So it's these little things that over time, and many paper cuts over time becomes a wound. And so that's essentially what then leads to this notion of racial battle fatigue. So like I said, it's not just that folks of color are tired. Yes, we are tired from racism, but it has these negative health consequences, psychological consequences, physiological, and then also emotional or behavioral. So psychological health consequences are things like frustration, shock, apathy, anger, hopelessness, Physiological ones are things like grinding of the teeth, headaches, high blood pressure, trouble sleeping. And then emotional behavioral are things like loss of appetite, increased use of alcohol or drugs, poor school or job performance. This poor school or job performance, in my case, is really important. So let's imagine a case where you're a person of color attending an institution, right? And you're experiencing racial battle fatigue. You're now expected to be in your classroom setting and show up and engage. But how are you supposed to do that at the same rate as your white peers if you have this extra load of racial battle fatigue on top of you, right? So of course it's going to affect your performance in your job. It's also going to affect your performance in your school, right? And so to me, this is why this is important, because that accumulation is actually having these consequences on our physical health and well-being. So then two pieces of literature that I think are really important for us to also frame this notion of racial battle fatigue is one, I talked about this earlier, but misogynoir, which is essentially the multiple systems of oppression that Black women are navigating. So Black women, because of their identity as both Black and women, they're navigating these larger systems of oppression. Racism is one of them, as well as sexism, right? So they're having to combat these systems of oppression simultaneously, which leads to an extra layer of fatigue that they're going to experience. And then self-care and healing. So what are the ways that people try to take care of themselves in the midst of this, right? So so healing is like a much more substantive process where you're addressing the root of the problem, whereas participants often said that self-care is more temporary. These are like the temporary fixes, and we'll talk more about those pieces in just a moment.